All right. Hello, bonjour, and welcome, everyone. My name is Melenie Olfert. I am the Business Information Officer here at the World Trade Center, Winnipeg. I would like to begin today's webinar with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are gathered on the lands of Treaty 1 territory and that Manitoba is located on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabeg, Innu, Denesalin, and Dakota Oye nations. We acknowledge we're also on the homelands of the Red River Métis and that northern Manitoba includes lands that were and are on the ancestral lands of the Inuit. The World Trade Center Winnipeg team respects the treaties that were made on these territories and acknowledges the harms and mistakes of the past and present throughout our nation. Thank you for joining our webinar addressing bias to build an inclusive and respectful workplace, which will be presented by Melenie Olfert. Before we begin, I would like to share a few housekeeping items. So the first one is please send all your webinar questions directly to the chat box, or you may unmute yourself and Melanie will try to answer as many as she can during the session. And then we're also going to have a Q&A session at the end. For all logistical questions, please send them directly to the chat box and I will answer your questions as soon as I can. And you will also receive a PDF copy and recording of this presentation within the next week. Now it's time to start our webinar. So I would like to introduce you to Melanie. Melanie works as an independent consultant, sharing her knowledge and expertise through leadership projects and workplace training. With a background in adult education and training, including teaching with the University of Winnipeg's PACE program, Melanie is now a published writer, as well as an accomplished speaker on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, collaborative communication, and leadership development. So welcome, Melanie. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Melina. And thank you to World Trade Center for having me present today. I just want to share also that you see the PowerPoint slide and I included my pronouns as well. I identify as she, her, and I'm very happy to be here. So the title of our webinar today, Addressing Bias to Build an Inclusive and Respectful Workplace. Firstly, I'd like to show you what we're going to talk about today. And I invite you to please use the chat. I have a few activities added in here where I'm going to throw you out some questions, some scenarios, and would love to get your comments coming back as well. And Melena, feel free to interrupt me at any time. When we're virtual, it's okay to interrupt. And if you'd like to come through audio as well, feel free to come, like Melena said, unmute yourself. Don't feel like you're interrupting me. It's all good. So what we're going to focus on, understanding and identifying what unconscious bias, a conscious bias is, as well as conscious bias, but the more challenging are the unconscious bias. And we'll define what those are and of course go through some scenarios, like I said, to really understand what some different types of biases at work could look like. I also have a little bit of discussion around common language to address unconscious bias, but also language that promotes bias as well. So we'll do a little bit of work around that. And hopefully you'll be able to analyze your everyday interactions and the work that you do to identify those possible forms of bias and some strategies to adopt a little bit more of a inclusive approach and the impact of bias. I was kind of reflecting this morning a little bit, and it's really funny. I've been a trainer, an adult educator for almost 2 decades. And it's funny how the different professional development topics have changed over that time. My number one used to be communication. And then it turned into intercultural communication. And then I was doing a lot of respectful workplace training. And then that evolved into bias training. And I think probably one of the most common topics that I'm doing today is around bias. And whether we title it with bias being in it or not, but the other one is building respectful and inclusive workplaces. So, it just kind of, the names have evolved a little bit, but these are the most common topics that I've been training organizations and leaders on. So it's really quite interesting. So moving on, let's take a look at the very first question. How does bias impact inclusion and respect at work? And does it? And absolutely it does. Whether we realize it or not, our biases influence our personal and our professional lives, from the way we think to the way we interact with our coworkers, with our leaders, with our customers. 100% they impact the way we think and therefore often impact the way we act. So biases are these, especially unconscious bias, are these mental shortcuts that help aid our decision making as the brain processes millions of pieces of information per second. So our brain will take these mental shortcuts to help us make a decision. And that decision doesn't mean always a business decision. It could just mean, okay, who should I ask this question to? Or a decision of what should I say next? And how should I say what I want to say next? So it influences all those little pieces of decision making that our brain does constantly while we're awake. That being said, these biases can lead to some skewed judgments and reinforce stereotypes as well, doing more harm than good for businesses when it comes to maybe decision making around recruitment, hiring, as well as how we do our business in terms of policies and procedures and decision making overall, and even the way we communicate and interact. So it's really important to be aware of these biases during different of these processes, because they can impact the success of your team today and your team tomorrow. So recognizing, combating biases at work. We're going to cover the 9 types of biases and some prevention strategies as well. And how does it impact inclusion and respect? If you take steps to reduce bias, it'll help you improve inclusivity, where employees feel more safe, more comfortable, more confident. Therefore, the domino effect of being more productive, being more efficient, working safer, being more respectful of the business, coworkers, customers, each other, as well as themselves. It also improves trust. When we have trust at work, it's the foundation of all the other elements I just mentioned. And of course, productivity leads to profitability and sustainability. Anything to add to that question? You can also give me a thumbs up reaction if I mentioned some of the thoughts you were having as well. Thank you. Thank you very much. And at any time there's anything to add, Elena will come on in and let me know. Lots of thumbs up there. Do I have a question?
There's none in the chat box so far.
Okay, and if there's any other comments at any time, come on in, everyone. People come to webinars for different reasons, but it's really, if you're spending the hour with us, that I'd really like to answer the questions or the curiosities you had in joining us today. So feel free anytime. Another impact of understanding and recognizing one's own biases as well as their colleagues' biases is to build DEI. Now, DEI is the short form for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sometimes we refer to it as EDI. I usually use DEI so I don't get them mixed up. So what is that? We have diverse workplaces. And diversity, of course, we have some great examples on the screen. Could be race, ethnicity, age, gender, sexual orientation, and so forth. But at the bottom there, it also says life experiences and personal perspectives. And that includes personal biases as well. Okay. So we do have bias at work, and some of it's not that bad. And we're going to talk about stereotypes today too. And guess what? Some stereotypes aren't that bad either. We just have to recognize that this basic human process of the brain, what it can lead to, and how it can impact those workplace flows, decisions, and policies and procedures. So diversity, people will have different biases. People will have different stereotypes, assumptions, preferences. But again, what do we do with them? Equity, just to briefly speak to equity, it partners well with equality. Equity means that everybody starts from the same place. And with that, we have to sometimes remove barriers so that people, diverse individuals, can have equal opportunity. So that might be to accommodations at work. That might be to opportunities for PD. That might be opportunities for promotions or cross development, cross training in an organization. It means that everybody has equitable opportunity to reach and achieve what everybody else can. And sometimes we start at a different place and require a little something extra to support our success. Equitable workplaces provides the opportunity for everyone to be the best that they can be at work. So something to reflect on in your own workplace. And then, of course, inclusion, embracing, respecting diversity so everyone feels valued and able to contribute to their fullest potential. Diversity's the fact, we go through workplaces, oh, we're very diverse. Inclusion is when the behaviors support that we value our diverse workforce. So where are you now? Let's do a little bit of a check. So for example, in your workplace, do staff understand what an inclusive workplace looks like, sounds like, and feels like? Does staff demonstrate behaviors that support it? Second, how much does the management team value the contributions diverse employees bring? Do you have diversity, respectful workplace, anti-harassment policies and practices? You might even have a DEI policy, strategy built in to the corporation, to the business as well. And it doesn't matter the size of the business, does it? What are your organizational values? And what are the performance expectations around these company values? For example, teamwork, accountability, respect, inclusion, quality. And where does respect and inclusion, where does that connect to being more aware and accountable of our bias? So some really good takeaway questions, right? To really ask yourself, well, where are we right now in terms of building an inclusive, respectful workplace? Kind of doing that little bit of an assessment. A lot of companies now will have a diversity committee or a DEI committee, and this is a part of it. And bringing and offering some development, some awareness around workplace bias. So let's start defining it. What is bias? So one example here I've given is bias could be, another word is explicit bias, and that's the judgment or preference made in favor or of or against a person, a thing, or a group. Then we have unconscious bias, where we're not aware of what we're doing. So a judgment made without being aware that we're doing so. And unconscious bias, another term for that is implicit. And often people are not aware of their unconscious biases. And sometimes we are. So with speaking to implicit and explicit biases, um, it's we have to recognize where do they come from. And I kind of briefly spoke to it a little bit already, but they really start in our early years, typically between 6 and 10 years of age, because we're just that sponge where we're really observing, and our development, if you talk to anybody in childcare, early learning, or education, they know that that is just where so much of our formative years are happening during 6 to 10 years of age. But it, of course, it continues up until our complete formative years, which is about 20 years of age, and has real world, sorry, that should say world, effects on behavior. It actually impacts both our professional and personal lives, but it does impact how we act. Our thoughts influence our actions. They're very fluid. So one can take steps to minimize the impact of unconscious bias in particular. But again, fluid could be, I'm quite, I kind of think that I'm quite aware of my biases, but there's often times when I go, oh, was that comment? Was that decision? Was that action actually bias based? It could be. It could be. And they happen subconsciously, and they can either be favorable or unfavorable biases. For example, a favorable bias, everyone from my town is fantastic. Unfavorable, everyone from that generation is lazy. And don't we have a lot of biases around where people are from or what generation they represent? Those are some very common biases. So with unconscious bias and bias, just I always like to show this image because conscious is when we're really self-aware of our intentions and predeterminations of people based on explicit prejudices or stereotypes. And then unconscious can be a little bit more tricky because we have these unconscious beliefs that are against or for different groups of people. And where do they come from? So before I talk a little bit about the difference between stereotypes and biases, our brain literally, researchers have theorized that people are bombarded with about 11 pieces of information at a time, but we can only consciously process 40 pieces of information at a time. So the vast majority of split-second decisions are made without conscious thought. Mental shortcuts still serve an important function. So when do biases occur, right? We have to kind of learn to be a little bit more aware of when they're more likely to occur, because unconscious biases happen automatically and are triggered by our brain making quick decisions and opinions about people and situations. They occur when your preferences towards or against something happens to impact your action. These behaviors happen most frequently when we are under pressure, we're overwhelmed at work, let's say, we're busy multitasking, or we're just simply in a hurry. And, biases go back to prehistoric times. We can't solely rely on our instincts when at work, because they may impact our customers, our partners, and each other because they could be clouded by our unconscious biases. So when we talk about prehistoric times, when cave people came out of the cave and they said to themselves, okay, am I safe? And it's kind of like that flight versus fight response. They're assessing right away. Am I going to be eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, or am I okay? Am I safe? Now, more modern day research by Heidi Grant Halversons, um, the question towards are biases similar to stereotypes? And her research says yes. And good people do have stereotypes as well. All we need to know is the stereotype to be influenced by it. So as soon as we learn a stereotype, whether we were 6 years old or 60, we're influenced by it. I liked her example before. Halverson gave this example. When you walk into a room and for the first time, you walked into that room and you see a chair, you know in your brain that the chair is for sitting on and not for eating on or climbing on, unless you're two. But this is because we identify the chair as a member of the chair group. Our brain is automatically categorizing that experience, that information we're taking in. And sometimes stereotypes are categories of people and can be helpful at times. We have stereotypes about police officers, doctors, in terms of, or accountants, in terms of what their jobs are about and how we interact with them, right? But of course, stereotypes never apply to every person. And of course, negative stereotypes are just simply wrong, just simply wrong. So what's the difference between the two, as my screen says? A stereotype is when an individual assumes a person has characteristics because they are a member of a group. Stereotype is a generalization made by an observer. Now, a bias is when these assumptions lead to a judgment or decision not supported by a fact or by evidence. Means that information comes from a particular viewpoint. Is that making sense, everyone? Do you want to give me a thumbs up if it's clear before we move on and start exploring the 9 types of bias? If there's any questions, please do let me know.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Would this be similar? Like, I'm trying to think. Sometimes we hear like descriptions about, like, let's say, characteristics of a baby boomer or characteristics of a certain generation. Where would that fall?
That's a great question. Thank you. So when we talk about characteristics of a certain generation, they are biases, and they're conscious biases because we know we usually have them. And like I said, that too, it's quite often a common stereotype or bias towards certain characteristics of generational groups. Now, what we use this for is when we know that a generation, when we learn or when we what we believe, that a generation has some generalizations, and we call those tendencies. That you know a tendency of younger people might be to really use their cell phone a lot. So that's a tendency. It's not so much an assumption that everybody of a certain age group will use their cell phone a lot, but there's a tendency, which is a generalization, or many young people tend to use their phones a lot, or to be on their phones a lot, or to use TikTok a lot, because I think everybody uses their phones a lot these days, right? So We do that, and that's where we are aware of these biases. However, when they lead to a judgment or a decision that is not supported by fact, because if I'm interviewing a young professional and I can't have that candidate be on their phone, the new hire be on their phone all the time, I want to ensure that that doesn't turn into an active thought and impacts my decision making. So I can be aware of that tendency. I can be aware of that bias that I think young people are using their phones a lot. However, if I'm aware of it, aware of my bias, then it should not impact my hiring decision. Did I answer that question clearly? And we often use, thank you, we often use the term tendencies. We use it in culture as well. When I do a lot of training on cultural diversity, certain cultures will have tendencies. Other culture, Canadians tend to enjoy hockey, for example, right? It's not all Canadians enjoy hockey, but it's a tendency that Canadians may have. So it's kind of choosing the right languaging. And of course, a bias can be both intentional or unintentional. So let's explore some of the most common types of biases. And then after I go through the types of biases, and feel free to take a picture of the screen because I'm going to give you a couple scenarios and ask you to name the bias. So affinity bias is a preference for those who look, sound, and act like we do. It's also known as a similarity bias. Appearance bias. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? It often leads to snap judgments made about a person's physical attributes, height, weight, could even be skin color, hairstyle, what they're wearing, etc. Confirmation bias is when we look for facts and research that support our existing belief about someone or an ideology. So we're seeking to confirm that what we think about this person, we're looking to confirm it. Attribution. Attribution is connecting unrelated behaviors or events and drawing incongruent conclusions. I want to explain this one a little bit. I'll give you an example. So let's say you're driving down the highway and someone speeds past you driving in an erratic, haphazard way. You draw a conclusion. You draw a conclusion often that the driver is careless, irresponsible, dangerous, a real jerk. Now, what you might not know is that the driver may have just been in a serious accident and injured themselves, and now they're driving to emergency. What you don't know is maybe they just got a call that their loved one is in an accident and is rushed to emergency, right? So we attach a assumption based on someone, a bias based on someone, based on a behavior. And that's called, we're attributing it to, oh, they're driving really haphazardly. They're a dangerous driver. Does that hope that makes sense? Okay. So here's the first four on this slide. You're more than welcome to take a quick pick. And then we move to gender bias. So gender bias is having favoritism toward or prejudice against a particular gender. Age bias, making assumptions about someone or their skill set, specifically at work, based solely off of their age. And it could also be the favoritism toward or prejudice against someone of a certain age group as well. Authority bias is when we place more importance on the ideas of someone in a prominent position or perceived authority. Now, the halo and the horn effect. So, the halo and the horn effect, the halo is when you have a favorable first impression that leads to positive assumptions about the person's overall character. And the horn effect is the opposite. You have a poor first impression leading to negative judgment of a person's overall character. So those are our 9 biases. Any questions about those?
I have a question, Melanie. I would like to know if there is any kind of test to know what are like my conscious or maybe the unconscious bias that could be taking an effect in my coworkers or my workplace, and I need to correct them.
Yes, there are some online assessments of your biases. Yeah, so you can go online and you can have your team participate in an assessment, and they're very interesting. But again, the assessment just asks so many questions, so it doesn't just make a clear confirmation that, I can assess what my biases are, but it works as a really good tool. And often there are workplaces that'll engage in bias assessments. Great question. Thank you. Should we practice?
Yes.
Here we go. First scenario, and then I've listed the different biases below. So Jared is involved in the pre-screening process to hire someone for a new position. During some small talk, he chats with a candidate who is a big sports fan, just like him. The two of them share the same favorite NHL teams and some favorite players as well. Jared strongly advocates for this candidate, frequently highlighting their strengths and downplaying their weaknesses. So, which bias is Jared demonstrating, displaying? And it could be more than one.
Would it be the affinity bias?
The affinity bias. Absolutely. So if I just go back here to affinity, a preference for those who look, sound, and act like we do. We have something in common, a similarity. Anything else you might attach to this?
There's a
Halo
few
as
people.
well.
Yes, a few people are saying halo.
Halo, absolutely. Thank you. Because they're using this one positive first impression to make a judgment of the candidate. Now, the candidate, are any of you assuming the gender of the candidate?
A few people said yes in the chat.
And are you making the assumption because Jared is frequently a male name? Are you making the assumption that the candidate is also a male? And if you are, it's okay. But I think for a lot of people, that's where our brain would go, especially since Jared is often a male's name. So could it also turn out to being a gender bias as well, if the candidate is also the same gender? Now, what can Jared do, a strategy to overcome affinity? Because that would be my number one go-to. We tend to often feel more comfortable around people who are like us. So we kind of have to challenge ourselves to break away from that a little bit and challenge our thought process. So when we're hiring, for example, because this is a hiring scenario, go beyond the hiring, the culture fit, a good fit for the position. Think about the cultural add. What can I add to my work team that doesn't necessarily match or fit in with the existing staff that I have? What can I add in that supports diversity? Culture forward is another term that's often used. Where do I want to take the culture of my department, my team, my business? And again, think this is where I want to go. This is what I'm looking for. So that might also be, because again, a lot of biases do come into hiring decisions. A hiring manager might gravitate to someone who, likes sports, like he does or she does or they do, and some of their team members do as well. Or they have a box that supports, the company's philosophy around sports, for example. So thinking about that a little bit, let's look at scenario number 2. A project team is formed to work on a major initiative. During meetings, some team members often dominate the discussions. One employee, Vanessa, has strong ideas but finds that her contributions are often interrupted or dismissed. When it comes time for leadership roles, the project manager often overlooks her, believing she's not as decisive and assertive as those chosen. The project manager overlooks Vanessa's strong skill set and qualified experience. What bias is the project manager and other team members displaying?
I would maybe say authority bias could be one.
Authority, absolutely.
And then someone is saying attribution as well.
Attribution, thank you very much. Love it. Could it potentially be gender as well?
Yes, and then maybe age. I mean, I know it doesn't really mention, but
Could
assuming
be.
maybe she's younger.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Some really good examples, and could be confirmation as well. So I actually took this from a real life story of a workplace that I trained in on bias. And the workplace was male dominating because the industry is still male dominated. So a lot of the female leaders, in terms of senior employees, don't feel as if their voice is heard in meetings and discussions and decision making, brainstorming sessions as well. And I will share this too, that the female project team member also said that she's often interrupted, and she pays attention to are other people being interrupted, and she just finds that she's more often dismissed, interrupted, or not even asked for her opinions and thoughts on the issues. Another comment that came out of that training was that when Vanessa would come to a meeting, that a couple of her colleagues would make comments about her outfits that day or her hair. One comment was, "Oh, your hair is up today. You must mean business." And when I asked the group the question, do you ask those types of questions or give those comments to your fellow male colleagues? No. Think about that. And it was kind of this aha moment for some of the people in the training that they just kind of went, is that what you call a bias? And I went, yeah. And again, now, how is that impacting Vanessa as well, right? Where she doesn't feel included, she doesn't feel valued. And one day, what might happen to Vanessa? She'll go somewhere else. And in our labor market today, we don't want to lose really good workers. Any thoughts about that or this scenario? I have one more. Imagine a manager who thinks an employee isn't reliable. Every time this employee shows up late or makes a small mistake, the manager notices it and remembers it. But when the employee does something great or goes above and beyond, the manager overlooks it. What's the type of bias the manager is displaying?
We have someone in the chat box that said confirmation bias.
Yes.
And
This is a
then,
classic one. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
no, that's okay. And then a few more people are saying the horn effect.
The horn effect. Thank you. Horn effect and confirmation bias usually go together. So great responses. This is definitely a classic confirmation bias. Managers only paying attention to information that fits their preconceived notion of the employee. So focus on information that confirms your pre-existing beliefs or ignoring information that challenges them. Because if you believe somebody is lazy, you're only going to notice the times that they're taking breaks, and you're going to overlook the great work that they do, right? So again, what can the manager do? First of all, they need to be called on it. And I would like to see the employee actually say, yes, I know I've showed up late a couple times, and I know I made a small mistake in doing this project. However, this is what I've done. And the manager going, oh, and re-questioning themselves. I'm going to go into some strategies right away to challenge ourselves on our biases. And one of them is using inclusive language. So just to make note of time, please add in anything you'd like to add in. But what not to say, we want to, often our biases come from the communication process, what I say or what I don't say. So we want to take away from terms of endearment, dear, sweetheart, because we want to use people's names or their job title. I remember going over my years of training where somebody will say, oh, well, I have to check with the girls in payroll. You have children working for you? Because they're not girls, right? They're women. But again, why do we need to gender identify? You have to talk to the employees in payroll. You have to talk to the payroll administrator. And then the next one, of course, is very gender specific as well. So we want to move away from gender identifying. How about this one? That's crazy or lame. Don't be so OCD. What's not appropriate about those comments? Anybody have a thought there? Why is it not respectful? Yes.
Sorry, someone said mental health issues.
Exactly. Thank you. So when we make comments like that, it diminishes some people's true experiences with mental ill health. Okay, so thank you. Husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, again, you spouse, partner, out of touch or stuck in their ways. Have you heard that at the workplace when addressing older workers? Thumbs up if you've heard those types of comments, or even outside of the workplace. And thumbs up? Yeah? Yeah. So, of course, don't make comments about people's age, whether it's older workers, younger workers, it doesn't matter. It's just valuing, because what it's demonstrating is an age bias, and just valuing the contributions that people bring. And it could also be a confirmation bias as well. And then, of course, the other ones support gender bias. We want to change those words to chairperson, to humankind, to police officer, and so forth. What are your preferred pronouns? What is not inclusive about what are your preferred pronouns? What would I say instead? How about what are your pronouns? If somebody's just joining your team and they haven't quite yet shared how they gender identify, ask. You know, we're a very inclusive workplace. What are your pronouns? My pronouns are she, her. When we add the preferred, it says that someone doesn't identify, that they're choosing a choice. But people who use pronouns are self-aware and own their gender identity. So preferred is kind of like, oh, well, today you identify as she, her. Tomorrow, what's your preferred pronoun? Right? No, it's what are your pronouns? Any questions about that?
I know that makes sense.
Yeah, so just like a little takeaway on using inclusive and respectful language, and it helps to break down bias. Now, what are the benefits of tackling unconscious bias? Attracts diverse talent. It helps us make fair decisions. It fosters building creativity and innovation. It improves employees' engagement, which most workplaces today, we're not at 100% employee engagement. We're probably the lowest that we've ever been. Results in higher levels of productivity and increases, therefore, the ripple effect, our company revenue. So most importantly, the benefits of tackling bias is being aware of one's own biases and calling out other people's blind spots and asking them to call us out on our blind spots, what we don't see, what we don't recognize as a biased action or comment. This builds the strong foundation of respect and inclusivity. So, some specific takeaways: how to overcome our bias. Ask yourself some hard questions. What might be those hard questions? Well, what am I thinking? What am I thinking right now? And why am I thinking that? How does past similar experiences in my life influence my line of thinking right now? Is the past experience actually applicable in a situation, or is it based off an existing preference or bias? And then actively question your thoughts. Why am I thinking this? Where is it coming from? How did I learn this behavior? Sorry, I needed a space here, pardon me. Unlearn some of your learned behaviors. And how to figure out, okay, what learned behaviors do I need to change, unlearn, look at it in a different way, is a lot of reflection. And that's where you're asking yourself those hard questions. Identify when you or someone else may be the receiver of a bias. Call it out. If I was in that session, that meeting, and somebody kept interrupting Vanessa, I would actually call it out respectfully, though, and just say, I think we need to give Vanessa an opportunity to finish her thought, to finish her idea. Seek out divergent and diverse opinions. Actually look for a different perspective. it's a part of the critical thinking process where we're trying, okay, I see it this way. And then I go to my coworker and maybe they have an authority bias because I've been doing this work for so long, or maybe because of my job title, and they agree with me. Oh, that's a great idea, Mel. Oh, okay, thanks. Purposely seek out what people who are doing the job, people who think differently, have maybe international work experience, people who've worked in a different industry, right? Just people who have a diverse opinion. And then, of course, where do we start? We want to build trust. I can't be the new hire and come into a position and right away be calling out people's blind spots. I have to come from building trust and respect. And one way to do that is finding commonalities across each other. Recognizing these biases is the first step to mitigating their impact. Okay, so have you seen some of these actions, some of these biased behaviors, and some of the examples I've shared? Have you experienced them? Have you heard them? Have you seen them for yourself? Thumbs up if you have. Thank you. Got some thumbs up coming, and that's great. Thank you. Now, I want to open the floor to any questions or comments. But before I do that, I want to explain the quote you see here. Viktor Frankl came up with this quote that I think is really, really powerful. And it definitely speaks to bias. So between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space is the power to choose our response. So there's a stimuli. Somebody has said or done something. And before I respond to it, and it could be inappropriately my response because I'm kind of shooting from the hip where I'm just saying the first thing that comes to mind to that stimulus. So I want to pause for a moment in that space before I do or say anything. That space is the power to choose how I'm going to respond. So if the behavior, I'm not really sure the meaning, the true meaning of it, and my brain's already started to take these mental shortcuts and make an assumption of what what their meaning of their message or action was, I want to question it. I just want to say, sorry, but what did you mean by that? I'm not sure I understand clearly. Tell me more. And then they come back and they explain it. It's also the great 3S approach. Anybody hear that before, the 3S approach? When again, you have that stimulus and it kind of pinches you and you go, oh, the first S, stop what you're doing, stop what you're thinking. And then suspend your judgment. And that's a hard thing to do. Suspending your judgment means suspend your bias. And then ask them, because the third S is shift your lens. So stop, suspend judgment, shift your lens, and find out where they're coming from. Again, what did you mean by that? I'm not sure I understand. Tell me more, right? I'm curious about the decision you made on this business protocol. Can you tell me a little bit about how you made that decision? Right? And again, it's just not passing judgment right away. It's just learning a little bit more so that my response is more accurate and, of course, respectful and inclusive and non-biased as well, because my response can be biased. Thank you, everyone. I hope you took your one aha moment away. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you to everyone who joined the webinar, and thank you so much, Melanie, for having delivered this very insightful presentation.